Now, our next presenter is Professor Daniel Broudy. The title of his presentation is Munitions, Microbes, and Messaging in the 9/11 and COVID-19 Terror Wars. And Professor Broudy works in Japan and writes about intercultural interpretations of text, symbols, sounds, and images. He integrates his postgraduate studies in psycholinguistics to help students see beyond the facades erected in mainstream media to deceive the public and manipulate emotions to obscure the empirical world. Certainly, that's very much relevant to the discussion we're having today. And with that, I'd like to welcome our next presenter, Professor Daniel Broudy.
Thank you, Patrick, for the introduction. And I'd like to also thank you for hosting the webinar. Before I get into the talk, maybe I think it's fitting to at least say a few more things about my background and why I write about the things that I do. I might be the only linguist among my other colleagues. I also, full disclosure here, I might be the only one who has experience in the military. So I was trained as an imagery analyst, and I have been very much interested in looking at patterns in images, text, signs, and symbols over the past at least the 1980s. And I kind of integrate a lot of my training during that period and my scholarly work in linguistics to try to understand the backstory or the underlying story, the subtext of messaging, the dominant messages that we consume in the corporate media. The messages that have, I guess, the most emotional impact on us, and therefore how we begin to perceive the world, understand it, what sorts of knowledge that we glean from the dominant media. So can you hear me okay? Okay. So I'd like to begin this talk with a universally true premise. Successful campaigns in war necessitate commanding control, both over the battlefield and over information. Since at least Panama, when I was serving in the military, I've witnessed firsthand how corollary wars unfold. The information campaigns waged against publics. Since I was in the intel field, I could see the stark difference between the mediated reality, if I can see the slide one, conjured up by corporate forms of journalism, and empirical reality, where facts could be ascertained from observed phenomena. Of course, this isn't so surprising since the military trained us to recognize and understand patterns of threat by observing how the enemy organized its forces against us in air, ground, and naval orders of battle. George Bush Sr. Declared that an invasion of Panama was necessary to bring order and democracy back to the nation, but everyone knew that Panama, since the construction of the canal, was never really a functioning democracy where the will of the people is respected. This claimed necessity to legitimize aggression in the interest of some phantom political order had me quite baffled as a young man. I think it's not surprising I became interested in the chasm between these two kinds of reality, empiricism, and the creative production of media narratives. Some years later, while trying to erase my own memories of the mayhem and bloodshed in Panama, I began work on a PhD in psycholinguistics to try to understand how language, signs, and symbols of thought could be used to address stress, anxiety, fear, and apprehension. And shortly after I began, the events of 9/11 unfolded. And as we all know, the world changed. If it weren't for the manufactured menace of Noriega or Saddam Hussein, slide 2, seeking to fortify Iraq's NATO naval wards, I wonder who could have seen how the new threat from a Middle Eastern madman would expose key trends in foreign policy. I think what's been most fascinating for me is the extent to which war often necessitates not just destruction of infrastructures and lives, but also communications and channels of communication. There's a lot of research in cognitive science and neurolinguistics. It can reveal how dominant corporate media serve to frame the aims of those in power. So, for example, if we're to believe the neocon concept of bolstering America's defenses, published precisely before the events of that fateful day, slide 3, then the 9/11 narrative appears to have framed the new Pearl Harbor, that so-called catalyzing event that precipitated fundamental revolutionary social change. Slide 4. It seems that in order for 9/11, the political narrative to remain intact and impervious to popular criticism, the hard sciences of chemistry, physics, engineering, architecture, and slide 5, metallurgy, had to be systematically subdued or controlled from the top down. While many scholars refer to this section of the blueprint, other parts of the conceptualization are just as relevant today to today's war on human perception. Consider the transformations we are told will unfold in the, quote, art of warfare on air, land, and sea, and how combat will likely take place in new dimensions, that is, space, cyberspace, and slide 6, the world of microbes. I struggled for about 6 years to finish my studies in linguistics. One full year required a seminar in the ethics of scientific experimentation on human subjects. And when the ethics committee was finally satisfied my proposed experiment would pose no psychological harm, my ethics application was accepted. I was, free to conduct my experiment. Big Pharma, however, struggled for 6 months or so to gain control over and experiment on societies around the world. They provide scant, compelling evidence that their experimentation on human subjects is ethical and safe. When people insist on seeing unaltered raw data of injuries and deaths, they receive instead psychological harm from mainstream media, carefully censoring and dismissing any points of view that depart from the approved script. Top managers of the CDC's Tuskegee syphilis study, carried out over 4 decades on Americans of African descent, I think would marvel at the breadth and depth of today's experiment on global populations, tricked or goaded into participation. Slide 8. The bread and circuses displayed nowadays illustrate how empirical reality must be tightly controlled and made increasingly mediated and virtual, since free, open, and direct engagement with the unmasked world beyond the socially distanced is being made increasingly hideous. Today's trends in which issues are framed, the agitation and integration propaganda that regiments the public mind, like an army would regiment the bodies of its soldiers, and the persistent repetition of conditioned responses shows us that citizens and nations around the world are in a highly abusive relationship with unelected bureaucrats and assorted figureheads heading toxic philanthropies. systems of public awareness and owners of the communication infrastructure, posing as authority figures, finance and profit from this kind of self-reinforcing feedback loop of material gain and influence over public awareness. So the question might arise, how can we know this? In nations that cherish free speech, the owners suppress the free exchange of alternative views that threaten the prevailing business model. These clear patterns of censorship reveal a kind of a fascist form of control over education and public discourse. Since the 9/11 attacks, the public discussion of these transformations, as others have noted, has been largely verboten. Apart from the corporate media framing of public discourse, in which is always structured to bound open debate, maybe I think the most salient attempt to regiment thought and speech appear in Noam Chomsky's own responses to questions about 9/11 and later about the current COVID-19 crisis. In a 2000 talk in Budapest, for example, Chomsky addressed some lingering questions about 9/11 and the JFK assassination. He notes, even if it were true, if 9/11 were an inside job, he observed, who really cares? I mean, it doesn't have any significance. Likewise, when asked about his thoughts on mandating human experiments, pretending to be licensed vaccines, he opined that people who refuse to accept vaccines, I think the right response to them is not to force them to, but rather to insist that they be isolated. I found these comments quite interesting. I've been using Herman and Chomsky's 1988 tome, Manufacturing Consent, in it, where they developed this propaganda model that hypothesizes how 5 filtering mechanisms work in mainstream media and democratic societies to create an acceptable residue of information fit to print, to make public, to broadcast, or to discuss. What's interesting to me is the 4th filter. Herman and Chomsky referred to it as flack. I think that's quite relevant to the contemporary world, where public discourse has become the battlefield on which fact-checking flak machines, corporate shills, and I think assorted sycophants to power appear to work in a kind of cottage industry to suppress truth. Flak describes efforts to discredit organizations or individuals who challenge or cast doubt on prevailing political narratives. It's characterized by a concerted effort to manage information that reaches the public. Maybe most significant is the gap between Chomsky's impeccable persona as a legendary champion of progressive values and the flack he produces for those who seek a genuine discussion of questions about 9/11 and the present crisis. In effect, seems to me, his quips silence people who seek real dialogue. I think contempt filters out of the discourse any critical discussion that might reveal the mountains of empirical and testimonial evidence, and thus challenge official narratives, whether about 9/11 or what's happening now with COVID-19. There is, however, something quite remarkable about thought and language, those unique properties of consciousness human beings alone possess, to kind of like go offline, as it were, to use the brain as a computer model, and to contemplate the veracity of a claim. When we go offline, we can reflect critically. Or a call to action. When we think about a call to action, we think about whether it's a valid claim. Rather than reflexively reacting in mortal fear for our lives, which the propaganda and mainstream media has been inducing us to do since the outbreak. I think the propaganda thus far has so rattled the nerves of many that the conditioned responses appear to have effaced the public's natural yearning for logic and reason. The elites, who have no genuine stake in preserving the social contract, know that the hearts and minds of the masses must be continually occupied by the sounds, symbols, colors, and images of the emerging order. I think nevertheless, some signs of change are encouraging, as Piers has pointed out. We're seeing demonstrations in cities around the world, even though the mainstream media, we don't really see those stories in the mainstream media, but in the alternative press, we do, certainly. I think despite their power over awareness and perception, it certainly appears that the major mythologies are crumbling in front of us. So in closing, I'd like to invite scholars interested in these areas to join us in the working group, join our efforts to return scholarship to a more respectable pursuit, unhinged, unhampered by the meddling that's been undermining free inquiry for the past number of years. So thanks once again for hosting us, and I will turn it over to you, Patrick.
Thank you very much, Professor Daniel Broudy. One comment I would like to hear your opinion on, and that is, first of all, it is extraordinary that Chomsky and Herman's work being so seminal in the field of propaganda, but yet the authors or the author can't apply it to some of the current major seminal events that certainly fit the bill in terms of their analysis. But my point is things have moved on as well, even from the 1980s, even from 9/11. We now have a social media, almost a platform, a monopoly in terms of audience on maybe 3, 4, 5 major platforms, and it's a two-sided issue. And I want your opinion on what do you think the prognosis is for this. On one hand, it's really opened up the discourse, and it's really become a disrupting factor for the mainstream consensus machine. But on the other hand, social media is also a flak battleground, to borrow the Chomsky term there. There's a lot of swarming, and I think to some extent it's been gamed by military operations. Certainly we have the 77th Brigade in the UK that's infamous. You have similar operations in Israel, in the United States, that are well known for being very active in this area, and the intelligence agencies in the West as well. So on balance, do you see this as a positive development, or do you think that it's also just become a platform for 24/7 propaganda in the smartphone, in the pocket, more pervasive propaganda than before? Or how do you view social media as an emerging phenomenon?
I often turn to the propaganda model itself. It's been condemned roundly since it actually was published in the late 80s. There's a handful of really good scholars around the world, fairly tight-knit community of scholars who use the propaganda model to critique the structure, the media structure, the system itself. It's a structural critique, actually. And I think it's the first filter where Herman and Chomsky talk about the influence that ownership has over the direction and the content of public discussion, of discourse, how it's shaped, shaped by ownership, very powerful forces. So if we look at the major players in the social media game right now, we see the same thing, essentially, as the legacy media. It's, the public discourse is really controlled from the top down by incredibly powerful forces, corporate power, and also we've learned over the past number of years that Facebook, for example, has great influence. It's influenced greatly by government. So the question, that's the same question came up in a talk that I gave in Madrid a couple of years ago. And I suggested maybe we need a new model. We see right now, for example, with UK Column and other independents, how readers support these alternative uh, platforms and outlets. So maybe this kind of model will, at some point, hopefully, it will become the dominant model by which we can maintain our rights, especially the right to speak and to think. So, and it might well, that model might well be applied to other areas, education, for example. A lot of my friends and colleagues say that higher education has been co-opted, not just the political class, but education itself. So maybe this kind of new model, a kind of discourse as a public utility or something to be protected, in like a utility that is meant for the common good, for the social contract, maintaining the social contract.
Yes, yeah.
Good
Well,
question.
that's an interesting segue, and certainly there's a lot to be said about the public accommodation of corporations or companies in the United States. When they first introduced corporations and companies in the United States, they had to have a public accommodation. One of those is they couldn't discriminate against their customers, or in this case, their users, and that seems to have gone out the window in recent years for the very reasons which you just described very well.
Corporate personhood, right?
Yep, go ahead.
Corporate personhood. I know a lot of scholars have been railing against the concept and the practice of corporate personhood. And I think that's really something that needs to be looked at, especially now, given the dominance that corporations have over our lives. Peter Phillips, I think Richard referenced Peter Phillips earlier. Peter Phillips has written extensively about this in a really brilliant book, Giants, where he kind of takes off on C. Wright Mills' work from the 1950s. But yeah, maybe that's an important area to look at as well, to really question the import and the meaning of corporate personhood.
Yeah, absolutely. It definitely speaks also to the whole issue of principles libertarians hold dear, and then the other side of that argument, which is that it's a private company, they can do what they like. Certainly, this is a really important area of debate and discussion, perhaps a topic for another symposium, another conference in the future. Certainly, that would be worthwhile. But I want to thank you very much, Professor Daniel Broudy, for your great presentation. Now we're going to take another intermission, a 5-minute intermission. So we'll get ourselves organized here behind the scenes, and we will be returning with section 2, the 9/11 wars and beyond. And we'll be hearing from Professor Jeremy Keenan and also Dr. Lucy Morgan Edwards. We're very much looking forward to that. I'm your host this afternoon, Patrick Henningsen. You are tuned in to the UK Column live stream, and this is Propaganda 9/11 and the Global War on Terror virtual symposium. We will be right back.